You walked here, I perceive.
Yes.
And on the left-hand side of the street.
Yes, that's right. But how in the world did you...
Simplicity itself. You've got a little reddish soil adhering to your shoe. They're pulling up the flagstones in front of the Wigmore Street post office, and as the pavement is covered with that reddish soil, it's difficult to avoid treading in it. The post office is on the left-hand side of the street.
Oh, of course. When you put it like that, it does sound simple.
It's elementary.
Hi, my name is Rob, and Robert Downey Jr.'s latest Sherlock Holmes movie has just hit theaters. It seems every generation seems to have their own Sherlock Holmes. I guess for the younger generation, Downey Jr. is going to be considered to be the portrayal of Sherlock Holmes, while Jeremy Brett was considered to be the official Sherlock Holmes on TV in the 80s and 90s, and Basil Rathbone in the movies in the late 1930s and 40s. But today I'm going to talk about an actor who in the early 30s was considered to be the screen Sherlock Holmes before Basil Rathbone took on the role in 1939, and he seems to be forgotten today. His name is Arthur Wantner, and he made a series of 5 films in England as the great master detective between 1931 and 1937. So I'm going to talk a bit about the actor, the series, and review each of the films. First off, who is Arthur Wantner? Well, Wantner was a stage actor who appeared in a few silent films before being cast as Holmes at the beginning of the Sound era at the age of 56. Reportedly, Wantner got the role of Holmes thanks to his stage performance of another detective named Sexton Blake in a 1930 stage production. Critic Vincent Starrett said, "No better Sherlock Holmes than Arthur Wantner is likely to be seen and heard in pictures in our time. The keen, worn, kindly face and the quiet, precedent smile are out of the very pages of the books." Now, unlike the energetic Basil Rathbone or the dramatic Jeremy Brett, Arthur Wantner's portrayal of Holmes is a little bit laid back, restrained, and very intelligent. He is not showy and he doesn't excite when explaining things to Watson or Inspector Lestrade, as Rathbone did. Now, his Watson was a British character actor named Ian Fleming. No, he's not the James Bond writer. And they made sort of like an older team. But unlike Nigel Bruce of the Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes series, he was not a blundering moron. He seemed to be interested in Holmes' cases and was willing to help out. In one of Arthur Wantner's Sherlock Holmes films, The Sign of Four, Ian Hunter took over as Watson, and he made him more of a younger, adventurous character. Fortunately, the films are set in then contemporary 1930s, meaning that you see cars instead of carriages, and the villains kind of remind me of gangsters from a Warner Brothers film instead of smart, gentleman-like ones. Alright, so let's start with the films, shall we? First up is 1931's The Sleeping Cardinal, which was released in the US as Sherlock Holmes' Fatal Hour. For decades, this film was thought to have been a lost film. I mean, literally, you couldn't find it anywhere until a print was located here in the US. Pretty much, Holmes and Watson are investigating a case when a man was shot in a bank vault. Holmes is convinced that the Prince of Crime, Professor Moriarty, is behind it.
It's only when you begin about this Professor Moriarty.
Yeah, you don't believe in him.
I ask you, is it possible for a man to plan half the crime in this country without the Yard knowing who he is, where he lives, or anything about him?
It does seem rather strange. I mean, the man can't live nowhere, never be seen by anyone.
Of course. Well, lots of people know him, but they don't know that he's...
The film takes advantage of dark, shadowy photography, although sometimes it can be a little bit hard to see what is going on. And besides Wantner and character actor Ian Fleming as the debonair Watson, none of the characters are really that interesting, and some of the performances seemed forced. It may be because a lot of the actors were from the stage. I remember a quote Alfred Hitchcock said when he was making his early British talkie films is that the stage actors oftentimes looked down on movies and just saw them as nothing more as a chance to get a paycheck until the next theater gig. This film does not get interesting until Wantner appears about 16 minutes in, and then I finally got involved with the story. I liked hearing him explain clues to Watson and Lestrade. And like a lot of early sound films from 1928 to, let's say, 1931, the film often features long takes and not too many close-ups, and there's really no music score since it would have been too expensive and time-consuming. I kind of like this version of Moriarty meeting Holmes at Baker Street. Moriarty shows up in disguise, and it creates tension, and you wonder, who is Professor Moriarty? And the dialogue between the two of them is good. It uses the famous "you cross my path" speech from The Final Problem. And while the story and a few scenes are fascinating, the technique of the time can make this movie kind of hard to watch sometimes. The second film that Wantner made as Sherlock Holmes was The Missing Rembrandt in 1932, which was based on the short story The Case of Charles Augustus Milverton. Unfortunately, no print of this film is known to exist. So we move on to the third film, which was The Sign of Four, also from 1932, which was based on the second Sherlock Holmes novel. And what a difference this film is to The Sleeping Cardinal. There are more camera movements and angles, more controlled acting, and there's some humor used. Holmes mocks an Inspector Jones who is called into the case later, and Watson pretends to understand what is Holmes talking about. We get to see Holmes go into disguise a few times, and Arthur Wonter is very astonishing at doing this. Like the novel, the film follows a young woman named Mary Monston who calls on Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson for help. Her father disappeared years ago, and not too long ago she received a valuable necklace by an unknown person. From there, the plot involves a treasure, an escaped convict, a secret pact among 4 convicts, and 2 corrupt prison guards. Now, personally, I was not really crazy about the film's structure. We see the backstory at the beginning of the film, and I felt like it took the mystery out of the story. And what this film does, that very few film versions do, is show Mary Morstan and Watson falling in love. In the book, the two end up getting married, but most versions don't use that subplot. I think the 2 actors playing Watson and Morstan, I think, had really great chemistry together, and it made their relationship credible on the screen. While the film has more camera angles, some of them made the story kind of confusing. There were a few times I had to go back to catch information I missed. Aside from that, the film is, for the most part, faithful to the book, often using dialogue from it. It's not as talky as The Sleeping Cardinal, and Sign of Four, it's not a perfect adaptation, but it is an improvement over that film. And it uses elements from that story, but it updates a lot. Next is 1935's The Triumph of Sherlock Holmes, based on the 4th and final Holmes novel, Valley of Fear. Holmes decides to retire from being a detective when he gets a visit from Professor Moriarty, this time without a disguise. They do the famous "you cross my path" speech from The Final Problem again, and then later on, Holmes is relaxing in his new country home when Lestrade calls on Holmes to investigate a murder mystery at a nearby castle. Despite Watson's protesting, Holmes agrees. It turns out that an American criminal organization has asked Moriarty for help to find an informant who sent them to prison. Triumph felt more like a drama than a mystery to me. Like the novel, there is a long flashback in the middle involving some characters, and this, I think, temporarily stops the story and the movie from moving forward for Triumph, I think, is the best shot of all of Wantner's films, and I think it's definitely the most atmospheric. While Triumph can be talky from time to time, it does move briskly at the beginning and at the end, and it actually uses a music score more often. While the story is not great and the structure is not great, I think the filmmakers were able to do more with this film than the previous one. And the last film that Arthur Wantner did was Silver Blaze. It was released in 1937, although oddly enough, it was not released in the US until 1942 and retitled Murder at the Baskervilles, probably to capitalize on Basil Rathbone's recent success, Hound of the Baskervilles. The story is taken from the short story Silver Blaze, involving a kidnapping of a racehorse and a murder of a stable worker, but the film feels like it's trying to fill up time. Moriarty is back again, this time for no real good reason, and when he's asked to take on the job of being involved in kidnapping the horse, he even admits in the movie that this case is kind of unusual for him. He is not menacing like in the previous films. This time, he's more like a gangster than a gentleman scoundrel, and his sidekick, Colonel Moran, kind of reminded me of George E. Stone, who was a gangster sidekick to a lot of actors in the 1930s like Edward G. Robinson. Henry Baskerville is also in the story when Holmes stays there on what is supposed to be a nice, peaceful, quiet vacation when this investigation, interrupts it. And there is also, this is the only time that Wantner dresses in that famous deerstalker outfit. And some of the male characters in this movie look alike, and it was hard to keep track of who was who. But unlike some of the earlier films, I found Silver Blaze not to be a chore to sit through. It moves briskly, Wantner and Fleming are livelier and move and speak faster than usual, and unlike Triumph of Sherlock Holmes, I felt more involved in the mystery. One final note, all the existing films are available on DVD, but the bad news is they are now in the public domain, meaning they no longer are under copyright. So a lot of cheap DVD companies offer old prints with some muddled sound and unclear pictures. I do recommend Arthur Wantner's Holmes films. I think he gave a fine portrayal, and while sometimes the films may not be easy to watch due to the time that they were made, or possibly comparing him to an active Basil Rathbone or Jeremy Brett, I think he plays the most observant and the most smart version of Arthur Conan Doyle's detective. So that's my review of Arthur Wantner's Sherlock Holmes films. If you've seen these movies, tell me what you thought of them, or if you have any feedback about this video. go ahead and post your comments. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you very much.